"You missed a spot worthless." The words hit like ice water down her spine, each syllable designed to remind her exactly where she belonged in this world. Lydia felt them settle into the familiar ache in her chest, the hollow space where her self-worth should have lived. She had heard variations of this particular cruelty so many times that her body knew how to absorb the blow without flinching, how to keep scrubbing the marble floors of the great hall while her soul curled in on itself like a wounded animal. Lady Vivian's perfectly manicured finger pointed to an invisible imperfection near the base of the ceremonial dais, her voice carrying that particular tone of bored disdain reserved for creatures deemed beneath notice. Around them, the great hall buzzed with preparation for tomorrow's mate selection ceremony, servants hanging silk banners and polishing ceremonial goblets, while pack members discussed the momentous occasion in hushed, reverent tones. Everyone had a role to play in the grand spectacle except Lydia, who existed in the spaces between importance, invisible unless someone needed a target for their casual cruelty. She pressed her raw knees harder against the unforgiving stone and attacked the already spotless floor with renewed vigour, her scrub brush making harsh scraping sounds that seemed to echo her internal state. The grey servant's dress she wore had been mended so many times that it looked more like a patchwork of fabric scraps than actual clothing, marking her as surely as if they had branded her forehead with the word Omega. Every thread told the story of her place in this world, forgotten, discarded, barely tolerated, but beneath her breastbone, buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed, something stirred with restless energy. Her wolf had been quiet for so long that she had almost convinced herself she was truly as powerless as they all believed, but lately something had changed. Dreams of silver light and ancient voices plagued her sleep, and sometimes when the cruelty became particularly sharp, she felt something dangerous rise in her throat like a growl that never quite materialized. The great hall doors swept open with dramatic flair, admitting Seraphina Blackthorne in all her terrible magnificence. Where Lydia was shadows and silence, Seraphina was golden fire and commanding presence, her honey-coloured hair catching the light like spun precious metal, and her emerald eyes surveying the ceremony preparations with the satisfaction of a queen inspecting her domain. Which, Lydia supposed, she soon would be. "Everything must be perfect," Seraphina announced to the room at large, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied anything in her entire privileged existence. "The Alpha King Kieran arrives at dawn, and I will not have a single detail reflect poorly on our pack's hospitality." Her gaze swept over the assembled servants with calculating precision, cataloguing their efforts and finding them wanting in the particular way that only someone born to power could manage. When those emerald eyes landed on Lydia, still scrubbing at floors that gleamed like mirrors, Seraphina's perfect lips curved into something that might have been called a smile if it had contained even a whisper of warmth. Instead, it was the expression of a predator who had spotted particularly entertaining prey. "How fitting," Seraphina purred, her heels clicking against the marble as she approached with deliberate slowness. "Our pack's most pathetic Omega, ensuring that even the floors are worthy of true nobility." She paused directly in front of Lydia, close enough that the expensive silk of her ceremonial gown brushed against Lydia's worn knees. "Tell me, little mouse, what do you think of tomorrow's ceremony? Are you excited to witness the mating of your betters?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Lydia knew that any answer she gave would be the wrong one. If she expressed enthusiasm, she would be mocked for presuming to have opinions about matters far above her station. If she remained silent, she would be punished for insolence. If she showed anything other than grateful servitude, she would be reminded of her place through methods that left bruises hidden beneath her ragged clothes, "I live to serve the pack's happiness, my lady," Lydia whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, but falling from her lips with the practised ease of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required swallowing pieces of your soul. Seraphina's laugh was like crystal breaking, sharp and beautiful, and utterly without mercy. "How perfectly you know your place. It gives me such comfort to know that some things in this world remain exactly as they should be." She crouched down with fluid grace, bringing her face level with Lydia's, close enough that Lydia could see the calculating intelligence behind those lovely eyes. "You understand, don't you, little mouse, that tomorrow changes nothing for creatures like you? The Alpha King will claim me as his mate, our bloodlines will unite our packs in an alliance that will reshape the Northern Territories, and you will still be here, scrubbing floors and remembering your place in the natural order of things." Something twisted deep in Lydia's chest at those words, a sensation like claws scraping against the inside of her ribs. For just a moment she imagined herself standing up, imagined looking Seraphina in the eye as an equal instead of a supplicant, imagined having the power to speak truth instead of swallowing it like poison. But the fantasy dissolved as quickly as it had formed, leaving her with nothing but the familiar weight of resignation and the burn of scrub water on her already raw hands. "Of course, my lady," she managed, hating how small her voice sounded, hating how easily she bent under the weight of Seraphina's expectations. "Excellent." Seraphina rose with satisfaction, smoothing her skirts with movements that spoke of lifelong confidence in her own perfection. "See that you remember that sentiment tomorrow when you're serving in the stables instead of the hall. I've arranged for you to spend the ceremony tending to the horses, where you can contemplate the vast differences between thoroughbreds and common mutts without disturbing your betters with your presence." The dismissal landed like a physical blow, but Lydia had been expecting it. Seraphina never missed an opportunity to ensure that any servant who might have harboured delusions of witnessing history was firmly reminded of their place in the world's hierarchy. Tomorrow, while the pack celebrated the union that would secure their political future, Lydia would be hidden away with the animals, forgotten and invisible as always. But as Seraphina swept away to terrorise other servants, Lydia's hand instinctively moved to press against her collarbone, where beneath the rough fabric of her dress her skin remained unmarked by any jewellery or adornment. 3 years ago she had buried her grandmother's necklace in the sacred grove beyond the pack boundaries, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath the roots of an ancient oak where the moonlight never touched the ground. She had told herself it was for safety, that keeping such a thing would only invite questions she could not answer and attention she could not afford. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the compound slept, and her dreams were filled with silver light and voices speaking in languages she had never learned but somehow understood, Lydia wondered if she had buried more than just a piece of jewellery in that dark earth. She wondered if she had buried pieces of herself, fragments of a person she might have been in another world, another life, where worth was measured by something other than the ability to remain invisible and absorb cruelty without breaking. Tomorrow the Alpha King would arrive to claim his bride, and Lydia would watch from the shadows as she always did, forgotten and discarded, and perfectly, tragically safe in her invisibility. The necklace would remain buried, her true self would remain hidden, and the world would continue to spin on its axis without ever noticing the girl who scrubbed floors and dreamed of silver fire. That had always been enough. It had to be enough. But deep in her chest, something stirred that felt like awakening. The ancient combat circle had been carved into the ceremonial grounds behind the great hall, centuries before any living wolf could remember, its stone perimeter worn smooth by countless trials that had settled disputes through methods older than civilization itself. As the sun touched the horizon with fingers of dying light, the assembled witnesses formed a living amphitheatre around the sacred space, their faces reflecting the particular tension that always accompanied formal challenges where life and death would determine truth from falsehood. Lydia stood at the circle's edge, her servant's dress replaced by simple combat leather that allowed freedom of movement while providing minimal protection against the kind of violence that would soon fill the consecrated space. The royal necklace blazed against her throat like captured starfire, its ancient runes pulsing with rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat as power continued to flow through her transformed body in waves that made her skin tingle with barely contained energy. Through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's desperate wish to take her place, could sense his wolf pacing with protective fury as he faced the terrible reality of watching his newly found mate risk everything in combat against an opponent whose entire life had been preparation for exactly this kind of violence. His storm-grey eyes never left her face, and through their connection she drew strength from his absolute faith in her ability to triumph over enemies who had underestimated the power that flowed through royal veins. Serafina emerged from the opposite side of the circle like a golden predator stalking wounded prey, her ceremonial gown replaced by form-fitting armour that had been crafted specifically for formal combat. Every line of her body spoke of years spent training under masters who understood that political authority ultimately rested on the willingness and ability to destroy anyone who challenged established order. Her emerald eyes blazed with the particular confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, who had built her reputation on the systematic destruction of anyone foolish enough to stand between her and her carefully planned ascension to power. "Behold the pretender!" she called out to the assembled witnesses, her voice carrying clearly through the growing twilight. "Behold the servant who believes that pretty lights and ancient trinkets can substitute for actual strength, who thinks that bloodline matters more than the willingness to spill blood in service to legitimate authority." But Lydia no longer flinched before casual cruelty, no longer absorbed insults with the practiced endurance of someone who had been taught that survival depended on invisibility. The transformation that had begun in the sacred grove was complete, the royal bloodline fully awakened to its inherited power, and the servant girl who had scrubbed floors while believing herself worthless was gone forever. "I see the daughter of murderers," Lydia replied, her voice carrying such authority that even the most dominant wolves in the assembled crowd felt compelled to listen. "I see the heir to conspiracy and violence, the woman who would claim queenship through theft rather than birthright, through political convenience rather than divine mandate." The silver radiance that surrounded her intensified as her power responded to the proximity of mortal danger, and through its ethereal glow the witnesses could see something that had been hidden beneath 18 years of systematic suppression. This was not merely a servant who had learned to conjure impressive illusions, but something magnificent and terrible and absolutely unafraid of enemies who had believed her safely eliminated with her grandmother's murder. Elder Thorson raised his weathered hands to command the attention of every creature within the circle's sacred boundaries. "Let all understand the stakes of this trial." His voice rang through the growing darkness with the weight of ancient ritual. "The victor claims not merely the right to mate with the Alpha King, but legitimate authority over the Northern Territories, the power to reshape pack society according to their vision of justice or dominance." The formal words settled into the consciousness of every witness, and through the crowd rippled the understanding that they were about to observe something that would be remembered for generations, something that would determine whether 18 years of injustice would finally be corrected, or whether the conspiracy that had murdered a queen would triumph through the same violence that had secured their original victory. "Begin!" Thorson commanded, and the ancient circle erupted into motion so swift and deadly that mortal eyes could barely track the combatants' movements. Serafina struck first with predatory speed that spoke of years spent perfecting the art of violence, her enhanced abilities allowing her to cross the circle in a blur of motion that should have ended the fight before Lydia could react. Silver claws extended from her fingertips as she underwent partial transformation, her golden beauty taking on bestial characteristics that revealed the predator that had always lurked beneath her perfect exterior. But the royal bloodline carried gifts that went beyond conventional supernatural enhancement, and Lydia's awakened power responded to mortal danger with abilities that had been dormant since her grandmother's death. Time seemed to slow around her as ancient instincts took control, as centuries of inherited combat wisdom flowed through her consciousness like water finding its natural course. She sidestepped Seraphina's attack with fluid grace that made the movement seem effortless, her own partial transformation revealing the silver wolf that marked her as heir to powers that most wolves had forgotten ever existed. Her eyes blazed with ethereal fire that illuminated the combat circle like captured moonlight, and when her claws met Seraphina's in a shower of sparks, the assembled witnesses gasped at the force that reverberated through the ancient stones. "Ah! Impossible!" Seraphina snarled as she recovered from the failed attack, her emerald eyes wide with shock at meeting resistance she had never expected from someone she had dismissed as powerless servant. "You have no training, no experience, no understanding of what real combat requires." "I have something you will never possess," Lydia replied, silver light pulsing around her as the royal necklace channeled power that had been accumulating for 18 years of suppression. "I have the strength of every queen who came before me. The wisdom of bloodlines that understood justice was more important than personal ambition." The next exchange was faster and more violent than the first, both combatants moving with supernatural speed as they tested each other's capabilities in preliminary skirmishes that would determine the true nature of their final confrontation. Seraphina's training was evident in every movement, her techniques polished through years of study under masters who had taught her to kill with efficiency and precision. But Lydia fought with something beyond mere technique, something that flowed from the royal bloodline like inherited memory, passed down through generations of queens who had faced their own trials and emerged victorious. Her movements carried the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the understanding that true strength came not from domination, but from the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. The turning point came when Seraphina attempted her signature killing technique, a move that had ended dozens of previous challenges through sheer, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Her claws extended to their maximum length as she launched herself toward Lydia's throat, moving with speed that should have made defense impossible for anyone without years of specialized training. But as the attack reached its crescendo, something fundamental shifted in Lydia's approach to the combat. She stopped fighting defensively, stopped trying to survive through evasion and lucky instinct, and embraced the truth that Elder Morrigan had tried to teach her in those first moments of awakening. She was not a servant pretending to nobility. She was the rightful Alpha Queen, heir to powers that could reshape reality according to principles of justice rather than personal convenience. The royal bloodline sang with approval as she finally claimed her full inheritance, as she allowed the accumulated strength of centuries to flow through her body with force that made the very air around them crackle with barely contained energy. Silver fire erupted from her transformed body as she met Seraphina's attack head-on, her own claws blazing with ethereal light that turned the combat circle bright as noon. When their supernatural abilities collided, the resulting explosion of force sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd and cracked the ancient stones that had witnessed countless trials without suffering damage. Seraphina's carefully planned killing strike shattered against Lydia's awakened power like waves breaking against unshakable cliffs. The violence of her attack turned back upon itself with interest that sent her flying across the circle to crash against the stone perimeter with sickening force. She tried to rise, tried to continue the fight that had been her last desperate gambit to maintain control, but the royal bloodline's full manifestation had overwhelmed abilities that had seemed so formidable only moments before. "Yield!" Lydia commanded, her voice carrying such authority that even Seraphina's rebellious nature felt compelled to acknowledge the power that blazed before them. "Yield and accept the justice that has been delayed for 18 years but will no longer be denied." The silver radiance that surrounded Lydia began to soften as the immediate danger passed, but the authority that flowed from her transformed presence remained absolute, undeniable, magnificent in its perfect rightness. The assembled witnesses stared in awe at the revelation of what royal bloodlines could accomplish when fully awakened to their inherited purpose, at the demonstration that some legacies were stronger than any conspiracy. Seraphina lay broken against the stone wall, her golden beauty finally stripped of all pretense to reveal the ugly ambition that had driven her to attempt murder rather than accept truth. The conspiracy that had shaped pack politics for 18 years was defeated, its primary architect exposed as someone whose entire existence had been built on violence and treachery rather than legitimate authority. Through the mate bond, Lydia felt Kieran's fierce pride and absolute devotion as he witnessed her complete triumph over enemies who had believed royal bloodlines were extinct curiosities rather than living forces that could restore balance to corrupted systems. The impossible love they had discovered in stolen moments was revealed as destiny's design, the universe's method of ensuring that justice would finally return to territories that had been governed by fear and ambition for far too long. The ancient combat circle fell silent except for the sound of Lydia's controlled breathing and the whispered prayers of witnesses who understood they had observed something that would be remembered in pack legends for generations yet unborn. The trial was over, the truth established through methods that no political manoeuvring could dispute, and the rightful queen stood victorious in the place where her grandmother's murderers had believed their power would remain forever unchallenged. Justice, delayed but never denied, had finally claimed its due. The sacred grove had been transformed into a cathedral of living light, ancient oaks draped with garlands of silver flowers that seemed to capture moonbeams and hold them prisoner within their delicate petals. Hundreds of witnesses filled the natural amphitheatre that the forest had provided, pack leaders and dignitaries who had come to witness not the political convenience that yesterday's ceremony would have represented, but the restoration of sacred bonds that connected destiny to justice through methods older than civilization itself. Lydia stood beneath the ceremonial arch that had been woven from branches blessed by Elder Morrigan's ancient rituals, her transformed presence radiating the kind of authority that made submission feel less like defeat and more like natural response to rightful leadership. The servant's dress that had marked her as invisible and forgettable was gone forever, replaced by robes of silver silk that seemed to have been spun from moonlight itself, their flowing lines emphasizing the royal bloodline that blazed from every fibre of her being. The crown that rested upon her dark hair was her grandmother's, retrieved from hiding places where loyal servants had preserved it through 18 years of conspiracy and violence. Its worked silver caught the ethereal radiance that poured from her skin, transforming the ancient symbols into something that looked suspiciously like captured starfire. And when the assembled witnesses gazed upon their rightful queen, they understood that they were observing the correction of an injustice that had poisoned their society for far too long. Through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's awe and fierce protectiveness as he approached through the gathered crowd, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the silver light that transformed the grove into something that belonged more to legend than to the practical world of modern politics. He wore ceremonial robes that proclaimed his status as Alpha King, but in his bearing was the humility of someone who understood that true partnership required mutual respect rather than dominance, that the strongest bonds were forged between equals who chose each other freely rather than through political necessity. "Dearly beloved," Elder Morrigan's voice rang through the transformed space, with the particular resonance that came from decades of serving as conduit between the living and the ancestral spirits who watched over pack destiny. "We gather in the sacred grove to witness not merely the union of two individuals, but the restoration of balance that has been missing from our world for 18 years. Her weathered hands were raised toward the canopy of stars that blazed overhead with unusual brilliance, as if the universe itself approved of the ceremony taking place beneath their ancient light. Around the grove, the assembled witnesses felt the particular stillness that always accompanied moments when destiny revealed its true design, when the seemingly impossible proved to be not only possible but inevitable. Kieran Blackwood, Morrigan continued, her pale eyes blazing with satisfaction, as truth finally displaced the comfortable lies that had governed their society for far too long. Do you come before witnesses and sacred spirits to claim this woman not as political convenience, but as recognition of the bond that connects your souls across any distance, through any obstacle, despite any force that would seek to separate what the universe has decreed should be joined? I do, Kieran replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had finally understood that duty and desire were not opposing forces, but complementary truths that had been deliberately obscured by those who profited from confusion. I claim Lydia Ravencrest as my mate, my queen, my partner in all things, not because treaties demand it, not because alliances require it, but because my wolf recognizes hers, because my soul calls to hers, because love has proven stronger than the political forces that would have kept us apart. The mate bond flared between them like golden lightning as he spoke the words that officially rejected everything his previous life had represented in favour of the truth that had always existed beneath the surface of manufactured obligation. Through their connection, Lydia could feel his absolute certainty that this moment was not merely ceremony, but destiny finally claiming its due, the universe's correction of imbalances that had persisted far too long. Lydia Ravencrest, Morrigan said, turning toward the woman whose transformation had reshaped the political landscape of the Northern Territories in the span of a single day. Do you accept this bond not as consolation for what you have suffered, not as reward for injustices endured, but as recognition of the partnership that will allow both of you to become more than either could achieve alone? I do, Lydia said, power flowing through her voice with authority that made every wolf in the assembled crowd feel the weight of royal bloodline finally restored to its rightful place. I accept Kieran Blackwood as my mate, my king, my chosen partner in the work of rebuilding our world according to principles that honour both strength and compassion. Not because I am grateful for his recognition, not because I need his protection, but because together we can create something better than the corruption that has governed these territories for too long. The ancient words of binding were spoken with reverence that transformed ritual into something profound and lasting, Elder Morrigan's voice weaving through the grove with cadences that seemed to call forth approval from the very trees that surrounded them. The silver radiance that poured from Lydia's transformed body intertwined with the golden energy that emanated from Kieran's wolf, creating patterns of light that danced through the canopy overhead like visible manifestation of the bond that connected their souls. When their hands joined in the final gesture of acceptance, the mate bond completed itself with intensity that drove both of them to their knees in the soft earth of the grove. Through their connection flowed not merely love, but perfect understanding, not merely attraction, but absolute certainty that they had been destined for each other since before either of them drew breath, that their impossible meeting had been the universe's method of ensuring justice would finally return to lands that had been governed by fear and ambition for too long. The assembled witnesses erupted in celebration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the grove, voices raised in acknowledgement of bonds that transcended political convenience and entered the realm of sacred truth. Pack leaders who had profited from the old corruption now prostrated themselves before their rightful queen, understanding that the world had changed in ways that made their previous calculations irrelevant. But it was not mere submission that filled the grove with joy, but recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that proved love could triumph over the most carefully constructed obstacles, that justice delayed was not justice denied, that some destinies were stronger than any conspiracy designed to prevent their fulfillment. As the celebration continued around them, Lydia and Kieran found themselves surrounded by silver and golden light that seemed to flow from their joined hands like visible manifestation of the promises they had made to each other, and to the territories they would now rule together. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors while believing herself worthless was gone forever, replaced by a queen whose very existence promised that strength would serve justice rather than personal ambition. "What happens now?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it reflected in Kieran's storm-grey eyes as they gazed at each other with wonder that would never entirely fade, regardless of how many years they spent together. "Now we build something better," Kieran replied, his voice soft with promises that extended beyond personal happiness into the realm of social transformation. "Now we ensure that no child grows up believing themselves worthless because of circumstances they cannot control. Now we create a world where worth is measured by character rather than bloodline, where strength protects rather than dominates, where love is recognized as the most powerful force in the universe." Through their completed bond, Lydia could feel the future taking shape around them, could sense possibilities unfolding like flowers after the longest winter, as truth finally displaced the lies that had governed their world for too long. Tomorrow would bring challenges and decisions and the complex work of rebuilding society according to principles that honoured both justice and compassion, but tonight belonged to recognition and restoration, and the triumph of destined love over political convenience. The silver crown that rested upon her dark hair caught the ethereal radiance that surrounded them, transforming the ancient symbols into something that proclaimed to every witness that the Ravencrest bloodline had returned not through conquest, but through the kind of love that made both partners stronger, that created rather than destroyed, that built bridges across any chasm that politics or prejudice might construct between souls that belonged together. In the sacred grove, where her grandmother's spirit watched with approval, surrounded by witnesses who had learned to recognise truth when it blazed before them, Lydia Ravencrest claimed not merely a throne, but a partnership that would reshape their world according to the oldest law of all, that love, when it was true and fierce and unafraid of consequences, could overcome any obstacle the universe placed in its path. The mate bond pulsed between them with rhythm that matched their synchronized heartbeats, carrying promises of shared purpose and mutual devotion that would endure long after the political structures they had dismantled were forgotten by history. Long after the enemies they had defeated were nothing but cautionary tales told to children who grew up in a world where justice flowed from royal bloodlines restored to their proper purpose. 3 months had passed since the night when destiny revealed its true design in the sacred grove. 3 months since the mate bond had completed itself beneath stars that blazed with unusual brilliance, as if the universe itself approved of the restoration taking place below. The Northern Territories stretched before Lydia now in all their rugged magnificence, lands that had been transformed from realms of fear and political manoeuvring into something that resembled the justice her grandmother had envisioned before conspiracy and murder had stolen her voice from the world. She stood on the balcony of the palace that had been built from the ruins of the old compound, its soaring walls constructed not as fortress against enemies, but as symbol of protection extended to all who sought refuge from the predators that still haunted the darker corners of their society. The silver crown that marked her as rightful queen caught the afternoon light with radiance that seemed to flow from within rather than from external sources, its ancient symbols proclaiming to any who possessed eyes to see that the Ravencrest bloodline had returned to serve justice rather than to dominate through fear. Below her, the courtyard buzzed with activity that would have been impossible under the old regime. Servants and nobles working side by side on projects that served the common good rather than personal ambition. Children played in spaces that had once been reserved for political manoeuvring, their laughter rising through the clear air like music that celebrated innocence, finally protected from those who would exploit vulnerability for personal gain. Through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's approach long before his footsteps echoed through the corridors that led to their private chambers, could sense his satisfaction with the morning's work and his eagerness to share the results of negotiations that would extend their influence into territories that had previously been governed by the same corruption they had worked so hard to eliminate. The golden thread that connected their souls pulsed with contentment that came not from personal happiness alone, but from the knowledge that they had built something worthy of the sacrifices that had made their partnership possible. "The Eastern Pacts have agreed to the alliance," Kieran announced as he emerged onto the balcony, his storm-grey eyes bright with accomplishment as he moved to stand beside her with the fluid grace that marked him as both predator and protector. "They understand that our way offers something their old methods never could, prosperity that serves everyone rather than just those with enough strength to take what they wanted from those too weak to resist." His hand found hers with the automatic intimacy of mates who had learned to function as single unit despite their individual strengths, and through their connection, Lydia felt the deep satisfaction that came from witnessing justice finally extended beyond the boundaries of their own territory. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors while believing herself worthless felt like a half-remembered dream now, replaced by someone whose very existence proved that worth had nothing to do with circumstances of birth and everything to do with the choices made when faced with opportunities to serve something greater than personal ambition. Elder Morrigan sends word from the southern reaches," Lydia said, her voice carrying the authority that had become as natural as breathing during the months of learning to wield power in service to principles rather than convenience. 3 more bloodlines have revealed themselves, ancient families who went into hiding when the conspiracies began, but who now feel safe enough to reclaim their heritage. We are not alone in this work, Kieran. We never were. The implications of her words settled between them, like promises of even greater transformations yet to come. And through the mate bond, she felt his wonder at the magnitude of what they had accomplished through the simple act of choosing love over political convenience, justice over comfortable lies, truth over the fear that had governed their society for too long. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice soft with the kind of vulnerability that only appeared during their most private moments, when the weight of leadership could be set aside in favour of the deeper intimacy that connected them beneath all their public responsibilities. The simplicity of believing that someone else would make the difficult choices, that your only obligation was survival rather than the welfare of thousands? Lydia considered the question with the honesty that the mate bond demanded, remembering the girl who had moved through the compound like a living ghost and absorbed cruelty with practiced endurance, because she had been taught that invisibility was the price of continued existence. That version of herself felt impossibly distant now, separated by transformations that had remade not just her understanding of her own identity, but her comprehension of what life could offer when lived according to principles that honoured both strength and compassion. "I miss the safety of believing I was nobody," she admitted, though even as she spoke the words she knew they were not entirely true. "But I would not trade what we have built for the comfortable lies that once protected me from understanding how much work the world required." The girl who scrubbed floors while dreams died in her chest was not living, Kieran. She was merely surviving, and there is a difference that makes all the sacrifices worthwhile. Through the palace windows that overlooked their transformed domain, they could see evidence of changes that extended far beyond political structures into the realm of fundamental social transformation. Markets where merchants traded fairly rather than exploiting desperation, schools where children learned that worth was measured by character rather than bloodline, healers whose services were available to all regardless of their ability to pay the fees that had once made medical care a luxury reserved for those born to privilege. "There is something else," Kieran said, his voice carrying the particular tone that always preceded announcements of great import. "Something I have been waiting for the right moment to discuss, when the immediate crises had been resolved and we could consider the longer implications of what our partnership means for the future of these territories. Lydia turned to face him fully, her awakened senses allowing her to perceive the complex mixture of emotions that radiated from him like heat from banked coals. Through the mate bond, she could feel his anticipation and nervousness, and something that felt suspiciously like wonder, as if he carried news that would reshape their understanding of what their love had created beyond the political and social transformations they had already achieved. "I have been consulting with the healers," he continued, his hands moving to rest on her shoulders with the gentleness that had marked their relationship from the beginning, when recognition had blazed between them in a stable filled with hay and impossible dreams. "About certain changes they have observed, certain signs that suggest our bond has created something beyond even what the ancient texts predicted when they spoke of true mates whose love could reshape the world." Understanding dawned in Lydia's consciousness, like sunrise after the longest night, and her hand moved instinctively to rest against her abdomen, where new life was stirring with the same silver radiance that marked her as heir to powers that most wolves had forgotten ever existed. The royal bloodline would continue, would extend into the future through a child who would grow up in a world where justice flowed from principles rather than political convenience, where strength served protection rather than domination. "Our heir," she whispered, power making her words resonate through the afternoon air, as if the universe itself was celebrating the news that the Ravencrest lineage would not end with her, but would flourish in service to the ideals they had fought so hard to restore. "The next generation of what we have built together." "The next generation of everything we represent," Kieran corrected, his voice thick with emotions too complex for simple naming. "Proof that love, when it is true and fierce and unafraid of consequences, creates rather than destroys, builds bridges across any chasm that politics or prejudice might construct between souls that belong together." Through the mate bond, they shared the moment of perfect understanding, the recognition that their partnership had achieved something beyond personal happiness or even social transformation. They had created hope for a future where children would grow up believing themselves valuable, not because of circumstances they could not control, but because of the character they chose to develop, where worth would be measured by contribution rather than inheritance, where the strong would protect rather than prey upon those who required their assistance. The afternoon light that streamed across the balcony seemed to intensify, as if responding to the magnitude of what they had accomplished, as if the world itself approved of the legacy they were creating for generations yet unborn. Below them, the transformed territories stretched to the horizon in all their potential magnificence, lands that would be governed by principles that honoured both justice and compassion, that protected the vulnerable while challenging the strong to use their abilities in service to something greater than personal ambition. "I love you," Kieran said, the words carrying weight that encompassed everything they had been to each other, and everything they would become as their partnership extended into the uncertain but promising future. "I love what you were when the world told you that you were worthless. I love what you have become as you claimed your rightful inheritance. And I love what we will build together for our child and for all the children who will grow up in the world we are creating." "I love you," Lydia replied, her voice soft with promises that extended beyond personal devotion into the realm of shared purpose and mutual dedication to ideals that would outlast their individual lives. "I love the Alpha King who chose truth over political convenience. I love the partner who stands beside me as equal rather than seeking to dominate or diminish. And I love the father who will teach our child that strength is measured by protection offered rather than pain inflicted." The mate bond pulsed between them with rhythm that matched their synchronized heartbeats, carrying emotions too profound for words and promises that would endure long after the enemies they had defeated were forgotten by history. In the growing shadows of afternoon, surrounded by evidence of transformation they had achieved through the simple act of choosing love over fear, They stood together on the balcony that overlooked everything they had built and everything they would continue to create. The servant girl who had once believed herself nobody had become the queen whose love had reshaped the world, and the future stretched before them bright with possibilities that their enemies had never imagined, rich with justice that would not be denied again, warm with hope that would guide their child and their child's children through whatever challenges the years might bring. What they had found in stolen moments between duty and impossibility had grown into something magnificent and lasting, something that proved beyond doubt that some bonds were stronger than any force that would seek to break them, that some love was powerful enough to transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations built on its foundation. The crown that marked Lydia as rightful queen caught the dying light with radiance that seemed to flow from within, and in its ancient symbols she could see reflections of the future they would create together. A world where worth was recognized rather than assigned, where strength served justice rather than personal ambition, where love had finally proven itself the most powerful force in the universe. The Alpha King arrived like a force of nature wrapped in flesh and fury, his presence preceding him through the compound gates in waves of raw power that made every wolf within a mile radius drop to their knees in instinctive submission. Lydia felt it first as pressure against her eardrums, then as a trembling in her bones that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition of something ancient and absolute. From her position, mucking stalls in the farthest corner of the stables, hidden away as Seraphina had promised, she could still feel him approaching like the leading edge of a storm that would remake the landscape in its wake. Kieran Blackwood was not a man who entered rooms so much as he conquered them, and even through the stable walls Lydia could sense the exact moment his boots touched the ceremonial stones of the great hall courtyard. The horses around her went absolutely still, their prey instincts recognizing a predator so far above them in the natural hierarchy that even breathing felt presumptuous. Her own wolf, dormant and suppressed for so many years she had almost forgotten its existence, suddenly lifted its head like a creature scenting its mate across an impossible distance. The sensation struck her like lightning, bright and burning and utterly wrong. Mates were for wolves with bloodlines and breeding, for females who could stand beside an alpha as equals, rather than servants who existed in the shadows between importance. Her wolf's reaction had to be some kind of mistake, some confused response to proximity to power that her pathetic omega instincts had misinterpreted as recognition. But even as she told herself this, her hand stilled on the pitchfork she had been using to turn hay, and every fibre of her being oriented toward the great hall like a compass needle finding true north. Through the bond that connected all pack members, she could feel the collective intake of breath as Kieran stepped into view of the assembled crowd, could sense their awe and terror and desperate hope that this alliance would secure their future against the harsh realities of Northern Territory politics. Seraphina would be radiant in her ceremonial gown of deep emerald silk, her golden hair arranged in intricate braids that showcased the elegant line of her neck and the Blackthorn family jewels that had been worn by mated queens for generations. She would approach Kieran with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worthiness, would offer herself as a prize so valuable that any alpha would count himself fortunate to possess her. Lydia tried to summon the familiar resignation that had carried her through 18 years of invisibility, tried to remind herself that this ceremony was not for creatures like her, that she should be grateful for the privilege of existing on the periphery of greatness rather than entertaining impossible fantasies about belonging at its centre. But her wolf refused to settle, refused to accept the logic that should have governed its responses, refused to acknowledge that some things were simply not meant for them. The stable door creaked open, admitting a shaft of golden afternoon light and the sound of approaching footsteps that moved with predatory grace across the hay-strewn floor. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of a dominant wolf's gait, the careful control that spoke of barely leashed power and absolute confidence in one's place at the apex of the natural order. "You can come out," said a voice like aged whiskey in controlled violence, each word precisely delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I know you're here." Every instinct screamed at Lydia to remain hidden, to press herself deeper into the shadows and pray that she had been mistaken for someone else, anyone else, rather than reveal herself to the most dangerous predator in the Northern Territories. But her wolf had other ideas, surging forward with a desperation that bordered on madness, demanding that she step into the light and face whatever fate awaited her there. She emerged from behind the hay bales like a ghost materializing from mist, her grey servant's dress dusty and stained with stable work, her dark hair escaping from its practical braid to frame her face in wisps that caught the dying sunlight. She kept her eyes fixed on the straw-covered ground, knowing that meeting the gaze of an alpha uninvited was a transgression that could cost her everything she had left to lose. Alpha King Kieran was even more overwhelming up close, his presence filling the stable like a living storm system that made the air itself feel electric and dangerous. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders and muscled frame speaking of a lifetime spent in combat and conquest. But it was not his physical presence that made Lydia's knees weak with the effort of remaining upright. It was the raw power that radiated from him like heat from a forge, the absolute certainty that he was the apex predator in any room he entered, the kind of dominance that lesser wolves felt in their bones and acknowledged through every cell in their bodies. His hair was dark as midnight and just long enough to hint at wildness beneath the veneer of civilized control, and when she dared to lift her eyes for just a moment, she glimpsed storm-grey irises that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the secrets she kept buried in the deepest chambers of her heart. He was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful, terrible and magnificent, and utterly beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, and Lydia found herself obeying before her rational mind could intervene with reasons why this was the worst possible idea in the history of terrible decisions. Their eyes met across the hay-strewn space, and the world exploded into golden fire. The mate bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting centuries to open, like lightning finding its ground through the path of least resistance, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. Lydia gasped as sensation flooded through her, warm and bright, and so fundamentally right that every moment before this felt like she had been living underwater, struggling to breathe air that was never quite enough to sustain her. She could feel him through the connection, could sense his shock and recognition and the fierce protective instincts that rose in response to her proximity. His wolf recognized her wolf, despite every logical reason why such a thing was impossible, despite the vast gulf between their stations, despite the political realities that made their bond a catastrophe that could destroy everything both of their packs had worked to build. "Impossible," Kieran breathed, but his voice held wonder rather than denial, as if he were witnessing a miracle rather than a disaster. "You're nobody," Lydia whispered, the word escaping her lips before she could call it back, carrying with it all the years of conditioning that had taught her to diminish herself until she disappeared entirely. "I'm nobody important. This is a mistake. It has to be a mistake." But even as she spoke the words, her wolf was singing with joy, was stretching toward him through the golden thread that now connected their souls, was demanding that she step closer and claim what the universe had decreed was rightfully hers. For the first time in her life, Lydia felt truly seen, truly recognized, truly valued for something deeper than her ability to remain invisible and absorb cruelty without breaking. Kieran took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her face, to confirm that she was real rather than some fever dream born of political pressure and the weight of unwanted responsibility. But then he stopped, his expression shifting from wonder to something that looked like agony, as if he had just remembered all the reasons why this moment of perfect recognition was also the beginning of their shared tragedy. "The ceremony," he said, his voice rough with conflicting emotions. "The alliance. Everything depends on—" "I know," Lydia said, and she did know, understood with perfect clarity that the mate bond changed nothing about the political realities that governed their world. Seraphina was still waiting in the great hall, still wearing the ceremonial gown of a future queen, still carrying the bloodline and breeding that made her suitable to stand beside an alpha king. The treaties were still signed, the alliances still necessary, the future of both their packs still hanging in the balance. But the golden thread that connected them pulsed with life and possibility, with the promise of something so profound and right that denying it felt like denying the rising of the sun or the changing of the seasons. They stood there in the growing twilight, surrounded by the scent of hay and horses and the weight of impossible choices, and for just a moment allowed themselves to acknowledge what they both felt burning between them. "This cannot be," Kieran said finally, but his eyes never left her face, and his wolf was reaching toward her through the bond with desperate hunger. "You understand that, don't you? No matter what we feel, no matter what this is, it cannot change what must happen tomorrow." Lydia nodded, tasting tears she refused to shed, understanding that she had just experienced the most perfect moment of her life and the beginning of her greatest heartbreak in the same breath. The mate bond was real, was sacred, was everything the old stories claimed it would be. But she was still nobody, still powerless, still utterly unsuitable to stand beside the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. "I understand," she whispered, and meant it, even as her wolf howled with grief at the injustice of finding their perfect match, only to have duty and politics tear them apart before they could even explore what they meant to each other. Kieran's jaw clenched with the effort of stepping back, of rebuilding the distance between them that duty demanded. But the golden thread stretched taut without breaking, would never break no matter how far apart they forced themselves to stand. "Stay away from the ceremony tomorrow," he said, his voice carefully controlled but his eyes burning with barely suppressed emotion. "For your own safety, stay away from me." And then he was gone, leaving Lydia alone in the gathering darkness with the scent of him still filling her lungs and the mate bond singing with joy and sorrow in equal measure. She sank to her knees in the hay, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened, by the perfect rightness of recognition and the crushing weight of impossibility. She had found her mate, and she would have to watch him pledge himself to another. The kitchens buzzed with frantic energy in the hours after the welcome feast, servants scraping plates and washing goblets, while the lingering scents of roasted meat and honeyed wine hung heavy in the air like ghosts of celebration. Lydia moved through the chaos with practised invisibility, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest that had not ceased since those storm-grey eyes had found hers in the stable. The mate bond pulsed beneath her breastbone like a second heartbeat, golden and warm and utterly impossible to ignore, connecting her to the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories through threads of destiny that should never have existed. She told herself she was grateful for the distraction of endless dishes, for the familiar rhythm of scrub and rinse that kept her hands busy, while her mind reeled with the implications of what had happened between them. But even as she worked, part of her consciousness remained tuned to his proximity, like a compass needle finding magnetic north, sensing his location through the great hall above where he held court with pack elders and discussed the political intricacies of tomorrow's bonding ceremony. The golden thread that connected them vibrated with his emotions, carrying whispers of his frustration and the carefully controlled desire that he fought to suppress with each passing hour. She could feel his wolf pacing beneath his skin, could sense the struggle between duty and instinct that made every breath an act of willpower. The bond was supposed to bring mates together, was supposed to create harmony and completion, but for them it was a torment that highlighted everything they could never have. "The Alpha King seemed distracted during dinner," said Maria, one of the kitchen maids, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone fishing for gossip while pretending casual observation. Kept looking toward the servants' entrance like he was expecting someone. Lydia's hands stilled on the pewter plate she had been scrubbing, her heart hammering against her ribs as she fought to keep her expression neutral. She had not been present during the feast, had been safely hidden in the stables as Seraphina had arranged, but the mate bond had kept her connected to Kieran's emotional state throughout the evening. She had felt his restlessness, his distraction, the way his attention kept wandering despite the importance of the political discussion surrounding him. Perhaps he was simply overwhelmed by the ceremony preparations, Lydia managed, her voice carefully modulated to suggest nothing more than mild interest in pack gossip. Such occasions carry great weight for leaders. But even as she spoke, she could feel him approaching through the bond, could sense his presence moving through the corridors above with the deadly grace of a predator who had decided to hunt, despite every logical reason to remain safely distant from his prey. Her wolf stirred with dangerous hope, with the kind of desperate longing that made rational thought impossible and transformed survival instincts into suicidal desires. The kitchen door opened with barely a whisper of sound, but every wolf in the room felt the change in atmospheric pressure that accompanied truly dominant presence. Conversations died mid-sentence, movements slowed to careful precision, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of absolute authority. Kieran filled the doorway like a living storm system, his storm-grey eyes scanning the room with predatory focus until they found what they were seeking. "Out," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet command that brooked no argument and required no repetition. "All of you, now." The kitchen emptied in moments, servants fleeing with the efficiency of prey animals who understood that remaining in the presence of an apex predator was a luxury they could not afford. Lydia found herself frozen in place, her hands still gripping the edge of the washing basin, her entire being focused on the impossible reality of being alone with him again, despite every warning her rational mind had whispered through the sleepless hours since their first encounter. Kieran moved toward her with the fluid grace of a wolf stalking through moonlit forest, each step deliberate and controlled despite the raw energy that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He stopped just close enough for her to catch his scent, pine and leather, and something wild that made her wolf whimper with recognition, close enough for the mate bond to sing between them like a plucked harp-string vibrating with perfect harmony. "I told you to stay away from me," he said, but his voice held no anger, only a kind of desperate control that suggested he was fighting the same impossible battle that had consumed her thoughts since the moment their eyes had met. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? What it could cost both of us if anyone discovered what we are to each other?" "I am nobody," Lydia whispered, the familiar refrain falling from her lips like a prayer she no longer believed but could not stop reciting. "Nobody knows me, nobody watches me, nobody cares what happens to—" "Stop!" The word cracked through the air like a whip, carrying such authority that her wolf immediately submitted, going still and quiet beneath the weight of his command. "Stop saying that. Stop believing it. You are not nobody. You could never be nobody, not to me." The golden thread between them pulsed with emotion so intense it took her breath away, with recognition and desire and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel precious in a way she had never experienced before. Through the bond she could sense his wolf, could feel the way it strained against his control, demanding that he claim her regardless of the political consequences that would follow such an action. "But I am," she insisted, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with the dangerous hope that maybe, impossibly, he could see something in her that the rest of the world had overlooked. "Look at me, really look at me. I have no bloodline, no breeding, no power. I am everything a mate should not be. I am a servant who scrubs floors and mucks stalls and exists in the shadows between importance." Kieran's hand lifted to her face with infinite gentleness, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with reverence that made her knees weak with the overwhelming rightness of his touch. "You have no idea what you are, do you?" he said, his voice soft with wonder and something that sounded like grief. "No idea what I see when I look at you. What do you see?" The question escaped before she could call it back, carrying with it all the desperate hope she had been trying to suppress since the moment the mate bond had snapped into place between them. "Everything," he breathed, his thumb brushing across her lower lip with a tenderness that made her wolf arch toward him like a flower turning toward sunlight. "I see everything I never knew I was searching for. I see the other half of my soul walking around in a servant's dress, believing herself worthless because the world has been too blind to recognize what stands before them." The mate bond flared between them like golden lightning, carrying his emotions directly into her consciousness with an intensity that left no room for doubt or denial. She could feel his absolute certainty that she was perfect, could sense the way his wolf had claimed her completely, despite every logical reason why such a claiming was impossible. Through the connection, she experienced herself as he saw her, not broken or worthless or forgettable, but precious beyond measure, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with conventional standards, powerful in ways she had never been allowed to explore. "The ceremony is tomorrow," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, but needing to be spoken, needing to acknowledge the reality that stood between them like an insurmountable wall. "You will pledge yourself to Seraphina, will bind your bloodline to hers, will create the alliance that both our packs need to survive the coming political storms." "I know," Kieran said, his voice rough with pain that echoed through the bond and settled in her chest like a physical wound. "Believe me, I know. The treaties are signed, the agreements ratified. Too many lives depend on this alliance for me to let personal desires override political necessity." "Then why are you here?" The question came out smaller than she had intended, carrying with it all the confusion and heartbreak of finding something perfect only to have it declared forbidden in the same breath. "Because I am selfish," he admitted, his forehead coming to rest against hers with a gentleness that belied the predatory power that radiated from every line of his body. "Because I have spent my entire life making decisions based on duty and responsibility and the greater good, and for once I wanted to know what it felt like to choose something purely for myself. Because tomorrow I will stand before witnesses and pledge myself to another, and I needed to understand what I was giving up in service to political necessity." The mate bond stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, carrying emotions too complex for words and desires too dangerous for either of them to acknowledge beyond this stolen moment in the empty kitchen. Lydia could feel his wolf reaching for her through the connection, could sense the way it mourned the loss of something it had only just found, could experience the exquisite agony of perfect recognition coupled with absolute impossibility. "I wish things were different," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart and the warmth of his skin through the fine fabric of his ceremonial shirt. "I wish I was someone who could stand beside you, someone worthy of the bond the universe has given us." "You already are," Kieran said, his voice carrying such conviction that for a moment she almost believed him, almost let herself imagine a world where bloodlines and breeding mattered less than the recognition that passed between souls destined for each other. "Never doubt that. What exists between us is sacred, is real, is more valuable than all the political alliances in the Northern Territories." But even as he spoke the words, they both understood that sacred truth and political reality existed in different realms, that the mate bond's perfection could not bridge the gulf between servant and king, between powerless Omega and Alpha, whose decisions shaped the fate of thousands. The golden thread that connected them would remain, would pulse with life and longing for as long as they both drew breath. but it would also serve as a constant reminder of everything they could never have. "What happens now?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it reflected in the storm-grey eyes that held her gaze with desperate intensity. "Now I go back to being the Alpha King who must marry for political alliance," Kieran said, his thumb tracing her cheekbone one final time before his hand fell away, leaving her skin burning with the memory of his touch. "And you remain hidden, remain safe, remain everything precious in this world that I cannot protect, if you come within reach of those who would use our bond against us." "And the bond?" "The bond remains," he said, stepping back with visible effort, rebuilding the distance that duty demanded while the golden thread stretched taut between them. "It will always remain. What the universe has decreed cannot be undone by politics or treaties or the wishes of mortal wolves who think they can improve on destiny's design." He moved toward the door with the controlled grace of someone fighting every instinct that demanded he stay, that demanded he claim what was rightfully his, regardless of the consequences that would follow such an action. At the threshold he paused, his hand resting on the doorframe as he looked back at her one final time. "Know this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Tomorrow I will speak vows to another because duty demands it, because the survival of both our packs requires the alliance such a union will create. But my wolf belongs to you. My soul recognizes yours, and somewhere in the space between what is and what should be, we are already mated in every way that truly matters." Then he was gone, leaving Lydia alone in the empty kitchen with the scent of him still filling her lungs and the mate bond singing with joy and anguish in equal measure. She pressed her hands to her chest where the golden thread anchored itself in her heart, feeling the echo of his emotions through the connection that would bind them together across any distance. Tomorrow he would marry another, and she would watch from whatever shadows Seraphina allowed her to occupy. But tonight, in the space between heartbeats, she allowed herself to believe that love might be stronger than politics, that destiny might find a way to triumph over duty, that somewhere in the uncertain future the mate bond might prove more powerful than all the treaties and alliances that currently stood between them. That had to be enough. It had to be. Seraphina moved through the corridors of the compound like a golden predator tracking wounded prey, her emerald eyes sharp with the particular intelligence that came from a lifetime of reading power dynamics and exploiting weaknesses for personal gain. She had noticed the subtle changes in Kieran's behaviour during the welcome feast, had catalogued every distracted glance and restless movement with the precision of someone who understood that knowledge was the most valuable currency in the complex economy of pack politics. The Alpha King had been different since his arrival, distracted in ways that suggested his attention was being pulled towards something beyond the ceremonial requirements of their political union. His responses to her carefully crafted conversation had been polite but distant, his storm-grey eyes scanning the room as if searching for something that remained frustratingly out of reach. Most telling of all, his wolf had been restless beneath his controlled exterior, pacing with the kind of agitation that spoke of unresolved instincts and suppressed desires. Seraphina had built her reputation on her ability to identify threats before they could mature into genuine problems, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that something fundamental had shifted in the delicate balance of power that governed tomorrow's ceremony. She had not clawed her way to the position of chosen mate through accident or fortune, but through careful calculation and the ruthless elimination of anything that stood between her and her rightful place as Queen of the Northern Territories. The servant corridors provided excellent hunting ground for information, places where pack members spoke freely because they assumed their conversations were beneath the notice of anyone who truly mattered. Seraphina had learned long ago that the most dangerous secrets were often whispered in the spaces between importance, shared by creatures who believed their insignificance granted them invisibility from those who held real power. "Strangest thing," murmured old Henrik, the stable master, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of bitter tea as he spoke to cook Marta in the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen. "Found the Alpha King in my stables yesterday evening, standing there like he was waiting for something. Never seen anything like it in 40 years of tending horses for visiting dignitaries." Serafina pressed herself deeper into the shadows beyond the doorway, her breathing carefully controlled as she absorbed this unexpected intelligence. Kieran in the stables made no political sense, served no ceremonial purpose, fulfilled no requirement of their carefully orchestrated courtship. Unless he had been meeting someone there, someone whose presence in the main compound would have been noted and reported through the gossip networks that connected every servant and guard. "Did you see anyone else?" Marta asked, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who understood that unusual behaviour from powerful alphas often meant trouble for those who occupied the bottom rungs of pack hierarchy. "That grey little thing that scrubs floors," Henrik said dismissively, waving one gnarled hand as if brushing away an irritating insect. "Lydia something. Was mucking stalls when His Majesty arrived, gone when he left. Probably fled the moment she caught his scent. Smart girl." The name hit Serafina like ice water in her veins, crystallizing suspicions that had been forming since she had first noticed Kieran's distraction. Lydia. The pathetic Omega servant who existed so far beneath notice that most pack members forgot her existence entirely, who moved through the compound like a living ghost and absorbed cruelty with the practiced endurance of someone who had never known anything else. But if Kieran had sought her out specifically, if he had gone to the stables knowing she would be there, then Lydia was no longer beneath notice. She was a problem that required immediate and decisive action. Serafina waited until the servants had finished their gossip and dispersed to their morning duties before emerging from the shadows, her mind already calculating the most effective approach to neutralize this unexpected threat. She found Lydia in the laundry, as she had known she would, bent over a wash basin with her dark hair escaping its practical braid and her grey servant's dress already damp with steam and effort. "How industrious you are!" Serafina purred, her voice carrying the deceptively pleasant tone she used when preparing to destroy something that had dared to inconvenience her. "Working so early in the morning, so dedicated to your humble duties." Lydia's hands stilled on the fabric she had been scrubbing, her entire body going tense with the particular stillness of prey animals who sensed the approach of a predator they could not escape. She turned slowly, her dark eyes wide with poorly concealed fear, and Serafina felt a familiar thrill of satisfaction at the power she wielded over creatures foolish enough to forget their place in the natural order. "My lady," Lydia whispered, dropping into a curtsy that spoke of years of conditioning in proper subservience to her betters. "How may I serve you?" "Such lovely manners," Serafina observed, circling Lydia with the fluid grace of a cat toying with cornered prey. "Tell me, little mouse, did you enjoy your conversation with the Alpha King yesterday?" The blood drained from Lydia's face so completely that Serafina thought she might faint, confirming every suspicion that had been building since Henrik's careless words in the kitchen. The Omega's terror was delicious, was everything Serafina had hoped to see when she confronted the creature who had somehow attracted the attention that should have been focused exclusively on tomorrow's bride. "I don't understand," Lydia stammered, but her voice carried the particular tremor of someone who understood perfectly and was desperately hoping that denial might somehow make the truth disappear. "Of course you don't," Serafina said, her smile sharpening into something that belonged more on a blade than a face. "Stupid little creatures like you never understand the games being played above your station. But ignorance is no protection from the consequences of interfering with your betters." She moved closer, close enough that Lydia could see the calculation behind her emerald eyes, close enough that the Omega could smell the expensive perfumes and oils that marked Serafina as someone who had never known want or degradation or the particular humiliation of existing at the mercy of creatures who viewed her as less than human. "Let me explain something to you," Serafina continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout could have achieved. Tomorrow I will stand before witnesses and accept the Alpha King's bond, will become Queen of the Northern Territories, will secure the political alliance that will reshape the power structure of our entire region. It is a destiny I have prepared for my entire life, a role I am uniquely qualified to fulfill. Yes, my lady, Lydia managed, but Seraphina could smell the fear radiating from her, could sense the desperate hope that submission might somehow protect her from whatever punishment was about to fall. Good, Seraphina purred. Then you understand why I cannot allow some pathetic Omega servant to interfere with arrangements that are so much larger than her tiny, worthless existence. You understand why creatures who forget their place must be reminded of it through methods that leave lasting impressions. She reached out with deceptive gentleness, her fingers trailing along Lydia's cheek in a parody of affection that made the smaller woman flinch as if touched by burning coals. I know what you are thinking, little mouse. You are thinking that perhaps you have caught the Alpha King's attention, that perhaps your wretched existence has somehow become interesting to someone who actually matters. You are thinking that maybe, impossibly, you could be more than what you have always been. The words hit their target with surgical precision, and Seraphina watched with satisfaction as Lydia's carefully maintained composure began to crumble under the weight of truths she had been trying desperately not to acknowledge. "But here is what you will understand," Seraphina continued, her voice hardening into steel wrapped in silk. "You are nothing. You have always been nothing. You will always be nothing. And if you ever forget that fundamental truth, if you ever presume to reach for things that belong to your betters, I will remind you of your place in ways that will make your current existence seem luxurious by comparison." "I would never," Lydia began, but Seraphina's hand cracked across her face with enough force to snap her head to the side, the sound echoing through the laundry like a gunshot. "Do not lie to me!" Seraphina snarled, all pretense of civilized discourse evaporating as her true nature revealed itself in all its calculating cruelty. "I can smell his scent on you, can see the way your pathetic Omega instincts have been stirred by proximity to real power. You think because he noticed you for a moment that somehow changes what you are, somehow elevates you above the station fate assigned you at birth." Lydia's hand came up to cover her burning cheek, tears spilling over despite her obvious efforts to contain them, and Seraphina felt the familiar rush of satisfaction that came from demonstrating absolute dominance over creatures too weak to defend themselves. "Let me be perfectly clear," Seraphina said, her voice returning to its deceptively pleasant register as she prepared to deliver the threat that would ensure Lydia's complete compliance. "If you attend tomorrow's ceremony, if you show your face anywhere near the Great Hall during the bonding ritual, if you do anything that might distract the Alpha King from his proper focus on his future queen, I will have you killed." The words hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall, and Seraphina watched with predatory satisfaction as their full implications settled into Lydia's consciousness. The Omega's already pale face went white as bone, her dark eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from understanding that survival depended entirely on the whims of creatures who viewed her life as less valuable than the clothes they discarded. "Do you understand me?" Seraphina asked, though the question was purely rhetorical. She could smell Lydia's fear, could see the way her entire body trembled with the effort of remaining upright under the weight of absolute helplessness. "Yes, my lady," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of steam rising from the wash basins. "Excellent," Seraphina said, smoothing her skirts with movements that spoke of satisfaction at a job well done. "I am so glad we understand each other. Tomorrow you will remain in the servant quarters, will tend to whatever menial tasks keep you safely distant from your betters, and will remember that your continued existence depends entirely on your ability to remain invisible and forgettable." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway as if struck by a sudden afterthought. "Oh, and little mouse? If you think to run to the Alpha King with tales of my visit, remember that he has far more important concerns than the complaints of Omega servants who mistake a moment's attention for lasting significance. You are disposable. I am essential. Never forget which of us the world can afford to lose." With that final cruelty delivered, Seraphina swept from the laundry like a golden storm departing, leaving devastation in her wake. Behind her, Lydia sank to her knees among the scattered laundry, one hand pressed to her burning cheek, while the other clutched at her chest, where something that felt suspiciously like hope was dying a slow and painful death. The mate bond pulsed beneath her breastbone with Kieran's distant emotions, carrying whispers of his own torment as he prepared for a ceremony that would bind him to a woman who was everything Lydia could never be. Through the golden connection, she could sense his grief, his frustration, his desperate wish that the world could be different than it was. But Seraphina was right. The world was exactly as it had always been, with clear lines between those who mattered and those who existed solely to serve the convenience of their betters. Tomorrow, the Alpha King would take his proper mate, would secure the political alliance that both their packs required for survival, and Lydia would remain safely hidden in whatever shadows allowed her to continue breathing. She had been foolish to imagine, even for a moment, that recognition from someone like Kieran could somehow transform her into someone worthy of standing beside him. The mate bond was real, was sacred, was everything the old stories claimed it would be. But sacred truths could not bridge the gulf between servant and king, could not overcome the political realities that governed their world, could not protect Omega wolves from the consequences of reaching beyond their assigned stations. That had always been the way of things. It would always be the way of things. And if she wanted to survive to see another sunrise, she would remember to be grateful for the privilege of existing on the periphery of greatness rather than entertaining impossible dreams of belonging at its centre. Elder Morrigan emerged from the shadows of the servant quarters like a ghost materializing from ancient mist, her silver hair gleaming in the pre-dawn light and her pale eyes holding depths that spoke of secrets older than the compound stones themselves. She moved with the careful grace of someone whose bones remembered centuries of witnessing the rise and fall of packed dynasties, her weathered hands steady despite the weight of knowledge that would have crushed lesser souls. Lydia knelt among the scattered laundry where Seraphina's cruelty had left her, one hand still pressed to her burning cheek, while tears she refused to acknowledge tracked silently down her face. The mate bond pulsed with Kieran's distant anguish, carrying echoes of his own torment as the ceremony preparations continued around them like the inexorable march of fate itself. She had not heard the elders approach, had been too lost in the spiral of despair that Seraphina's threats had carved into her consciousness. "Child," Morrigan said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness reserved for wounded creatures who required careful handling lest they bolt into deeper danger. "Look at me." Lydia's head lifted with reluctant obedience, her dark eyes wide with poorly concealed terror and the kind of hopelessness that came from understanding that survival depended entirely on remaining invisible to those who wielded real power. But when her gaze met Morrigan's ancient stare, something shifted in the elder's expression, recognition flickering across her weathered features like lightning illuminating storm clouds. "By the sacred moon," Morrigan breathed, her voice rough with shock and something that sounded suspiciously like reverence. "I had heard whispers, had sensed the stirring of old magic, but I never imagined—" She moved closer with sudden urgency, her pale eyes cataloguing details that others had overlooked for 18 years. "Your eyes, the shape of your face, the way you carry yourself despite everything they have done to break your spirit." "I don't understand," Lydia whispered, but even as she spoke the words her wolf stirred with restless energy, responding to something in the elder's presence that felt like recognition, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. Morrigan knelt beside her with fluid grace that belied her apparent age, her hands reaching out to frame Lydia's face with infinite gentleness. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she said, her voice thick with emotions too complex to untangle. Evelyn's eyes. I would know them anywhere, even dulled by years of suppression and hidden beneath the mask of servitude they forced you to wear. The name hit Lydia like a physical blow, carrying with it fragments of half-remembered lullabies and the phantom scent of jasmine and moonlight that had haunted her dreams since childhood. Her grandmother had been a shadowy figure in her earliest memories, a presence that radiated warmth and safety before disappearing into the void that had claimed so many details of Lydia's origins. "My grandmother was a servant," Lydia said, the words falling from her lips with the automatic recitation of someone who had been told the same story so many times it had become truth through repetition. "She died when I was small. There is nothing special about her bloodline, nothing that would—" "Your grandmother," Morrigan interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the events she described, "was Evelyn Ravencrest, the rightful Alpha Queen of the Northern Territories. She was murdered 18 years ago by those who feared her power, who understood that her bloodline carried gifts that could reshape the political landscape of our entire region." The world tilted on its axis around Lydia, reality reshaping itself to accommodate truths that made mockery of everything she had been taught about her own identity. The mate bond flared beneath her breastbone as if responding to the revelation, golden light pulsing in rhythm with her racing heartbeat as pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed began clicking into place. "That's impossible," she breathed, but even as she spoke the words her wolf was singing with recognition, was stretching towards something that felt like destiny finally revealing its true shape. "I am nobody. I have no power, no bloodline, no—" "You have been deliberately suppressed," Morrigan said, her voice gentle but implacable in its certainty. "Bound by magic so old and complex that most who practice the ancient arts would not recognize its signature. Your wolf has been caged, your power locked away, your very memories altered to hide you from those who would see you dead if they understood what walks among them in servants' clothing." She reached into the folds of her dark robes and withdrew something that made Lydia's breath catch in her throat with the force of recognition. It was a pendant of worked silver, intricate beyond description, bearing runes that seemed to shift and writhe in the pre-dawn light like living things hungry for acknowledgement. At its centre rested a stone that captured moonlight and held it prisoner, transforming the captured illumination into something that looked suspiciously like liquid starfire. "The Ravencrest seal," Morrigan said, her voice reverent as she held the pendant between them like an offering to forgotten gods. "The mark of the true royal bloodline, passed from queen to daughter through generations stretching back to the founding of our people. Your grandmother died protecting this, died ensuring that it would remain hidden until the day her heir was strong enough to reclaim what was stolen from her." Lydia's hand moved without conscious direction, reaching toward the pendant with fingers that trembled with the weight of destiny finally revealing its true face. The moment her skin made contact with the worked silver, the world exploded into sensation so intense it drove her to her knees with the sheer overwhelming force of recognition. Power flooded through her like wildfire given consciousness, like lightning finding its ground through every cell in her body. The magical bindings that had held her wolf captive for 18 years cracked like ice under the spring sun, releasing abilities that had been compressed and concentrated by years of suppression until they emerged with the force of a dam finally bursting under irresistible pressure. Her wolf surged forward with savage joy, no longer the cowering creature that had learned to hide from the casual cruelty of pack life, but something ancient and proud and absolutely unafraid of the power that flowed through her veins like molten silver. Through the pendant's connection to her bloodline, Lydia could feel the presence of her ancestors, could sense the long line of queens who had ruled with wisdom and strength until political treachery had stolen their legacy from the world. "The binding spell weakened when you encountered your true mate," Morrigan explained, her voice seeming to come from a great distance as Lydia struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening to her. The mate bond is sacred magic, older and stronger than any artificial constraints. It recognized what you truly are and began the process of setting you free, but the pendant was needed to complete the awakening. Lydia could feel herself changing, could sense dormant abilities stirring to life, like flowers blooming after a long and terrible winter. Her senses sharpened until she could distinguish individual heartbeats from every creature within a mile radius, could taste emotions on the air like wine on her tongue, could see the threads of power that connected all living things in an intricate web of cause and effect. "What am I?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer, could feel it settling into her bones with the weight of absolute truth. "You are the last of the Ravencrest bloodline," Morrigan said, her voice thick with pride and ancient grief. "You are the rightful Alpha Queen of the Northern Territories, heir to powers that most wolves have forgotten ever existed. You are what they have feared since the day they murdered your grandmother and scattered her court to the winds." The pendant pulsed against her palm with rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and through its connection to her heritage, Lydia could see fragments of the truth that had been hidden from her. Images flickered through her consciousness like scenes from a half-remembered dream. Her grandmother standing tall and proud before a court of wolves who looked at her with reverence rather than dismissal, battles fought with powers that bent reality itself to the will of those with royal blood, a conspiracy of lesser wolves who feared what they could not control and chose murder over submission to their rightful queen. "They killed her because she was too powerful," Lydia said, the words emerging from some deep well of inherited memory. "Because she threatened the established order, because she would have ruled with justice rather than allowing the strong to prey upon the weak." "They killed her because she was pregnant," Morrigan corrected, her voice heavy with the weight of old sorrow. "Because they understood that a child born of her bloodline would grow to surpass even her considerable abilities. You were meant to be the most powerful Alpha Queen in the history of our people, destined to unite the fractured packs under a single banner of justice and strength." The revelation hit like a physical blow, reshaping everything Lydia thought she understood about her place in the world. She had not been born worthless, had not been assigned servitude by fate or genetics or the natural order of pack hierarchy. She had been deliberately broken, systematically diminished, carefully maintained in a state of powerlessness by those who understood that her true nature posed an existential threat to their comfortable dominance over creatures they deemed lesser. "The ceremony," she said, the words emerging through lips that felt numb with shock. "Tomorrow, Kieran will mate with Seraphina, will bind his bloodline to hers, will create the alliance that—" "Will cement the power of those who murdered your family," Morrigan finished, her pale eyes blazing with ancient fury. "Seraphina Blackthorne is the daughter of Marcus Blackthorne, who led the conspiracy against your grandmother. This entire ceremony, this political marriage, is designed to ensure that the royal bloodline can never reclaim its rightful place." The mate bond flared with sudden understanding, carrying Kieran's emotions across the distance between them with crystal clarity. Through the connection, Lydia could feel his wolf responding to the awakening of her power, could sense his confusion and wonder as something fundamental shifted in the energy that connected their souls. He would be feeling her transformation, would understand instinctively that the servant he had recognized as his mate was revealing herself to be something far more significant than either of them had imagined. "He doesn't know," Lydia breathed, understanding flooding through her with the force of revelation. "Kieran doesn't know what I am, doesn't know what this alliance really represents." "Few remember the old bloodlines," Morrigan agreed. "The conspirators have spent 18 years ensuring that the history of your grandmother's reign was forgotten, that the circumstances of her death were attributed to territorial disputes rather than systematic assassination. They have been very careful to eliminate anyone who might recognize the signs of royal heritage awakening. "Then I have to tell him," Lydia said, power flowing through her voice with authority she had never possessed before. "I have to warn him before—" "You have to survive until tomorrow night," Morrigan interrupted, her voice sharp with urgency. "The awakening has begun, but it is not complete. The pendant will continue to unlock your abilities over the next day, will restore powers that have been dormant since birth, but you are still vulnerable until the process reaches its conclusion. Serafina and her faction will sense the change, will understand that their carefully constructed plans are being threatened by forces they thought they had eliminated." Through the mate bond, Lydia could feel Kieran's growing agitation, could sense his wolf pushing him toward action, despite every logical reason to maintain the distance that duty demanded. The ceremony was hours away, the political machinery already in motion, but the universe itself seemed to be reshaping around the awakening of her true identity. "What do I do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer, could feel it settling into her consciousness with the weight of inherited wisdom. "You reclaim what was stolen from you," Morrigan said, her voice ringing with the authority of ancient prophecy. "You take your rightful place as Alpha Queen. You expose the conspiracy that has shaped pack politics for 18 years, and you ensure that justice finally comes to those who believed themselves beyond the reach of consequences." The pendant pulsed with warmth against her palm, and through its connection to her bloodline, Lydia could feel the presence of her grandmother, could sense Evelyn's spirit offering strength and guidance from beyond the veil of death. She was no longer the broken servant who had scrubbed floors and absorbed cruelty with practiced endurance. She was the heir to powers that could reshape the world, the rightful queen of territories that stretched beyond the horizon, the mate of an Alpha King who would finally understand that destiny had given them something far more significant than political convenience. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. She had to endure whatever tests awaited her as her power continued to awaken. And she had to find a way to reveal the truth before Serafina's faction could eliminate the threat her existence posed to their carefully maintained control. The grey servant's dress she wore felt like a costume now, a disguise that no longer fit the reality of what she was becoming. Tomorrow, when the sun set on the ceremony that was supposed to cement her enemy's victory, Lydia Ravencrest would step into the light as the rightful queen she had always been meant to be. The world was about to discover that some bloodlines could not be suppressed forever, that some destinies were stronger than any conspiracy, and that the universe had its own sense of justice for those who believed themselves above the consequences of their actions. The sacred grove stood at the eastern edge of Pack territory like a cathedral built by ancient hands from living wood and shadow, its towering oaks older than memory, and its undergrowth thick with the kind of primal energy that made civilized wolves remember their wild origins. Lydia moved through the darkness with newfound grace, her awakening power allowing her to navigate the twisted paths with supernatural certainty, following instincts that belonged to the royal bloodline rather than the broken servant she had been mere hours before. The pendant rested against her collarbone beneath her rough servant's dress, its warmth spreading through her body like liquid starfire as her abilities continued to unfold with each passing moment. She could feel the forest responding to her presence, could sense the way the very trees seemed to lean toward her with recognition that belonged to something deeper than simple woodland instinct. This place remembered her grandmother, remembered the true queens who had walked these paths when the world was younger, and justice flowed from royal bloodlines rather than political convenience. The burial site called to her through bonds that transcended conscious memory, drawing her toward the ancient oak where 18 years ago her dying grandmother had hidden the most precious artifact of their bloodline with her final breath. Lydia could see it now through the awakened connection to her heritage, could feel the necklace's presence like a beacon burning in the earth beneath roots that had grown thick and protective around their sacred charge. Her hands moved without conscious direction, scraping away layers of rich soil and decomposed leaves until her fingers found the oiled cloth that had preserved her legacy through nearly 2 decades of patient waiting. The moment her skin made contact with the fabric, the forest around her exploded into silver light so brilliant it turned midnight into noon, so pure it seemed to wash away the shadows that had clung to her soul since childhood. The necklace emerged from its earthen tomb like a sleeping queen awakening to reclaim her throne, its worked silver gleaming with inner fire, and its central gemstone pulsing in rhythm with Lydia's heartbeat. Ancient runes covered its surface in patterns that shifted and writhed in the supernatural illumination, telling stories of power and justice and queens who had ruled with wisdom that bent the very fabric of reality to their will. But this was more than mere jewellery, more than symbol or decoration. This was the physical anchor of royal authority, the artifact that had channeled the abilities of her bloodline for generations beyond counting. As her fingers closed around the silver chain, power flooded through her with intensity that drove her to her knees in the rich earth, every nerve ending singing with electricity as dormant abilities roared to life like dams finally bursting under irresistible pressure. Her wolf surged forward with savage triumph, no longer the cowering creature that had learned to hide from casual cruelty, but something magnificent and terrible and absolutely unafraid of the strength that flowed through her transformed body. Through the necklace's connection to her heritage, she could feel the presence of every Ravencrest queen who had come before, could sense their approval as their heir finally claimed the power that had always been her birthright. The silver light that emanated from her skin illuminated the grove like captured moonbeams, and in that ethereal glow Lydia finally understood what she had always been meant to become. Not the broken servant who scrubbed floors and absorbed humiliation with practiced endurance, but a queen whose very existence could reshape the political landscape of the Northern Territories, whose mate bond with Kieran was not accident or cruel irony, but destiny finally revealing its true design. "I wondered if you would come here tonight," said a voice like aged whiskey and controlled violence, familiar enough to make her heart skip, despite the impossible circumstances that should have kept him safely distant from whatever transformation was overtaking her. "I wondered if the bond would guide you to the truth, or if you would remain lost in the lies they taught you about your own worth." Kieran emerged from the shadows between the trees like a predator materializing from darkness, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the silver light that poured from her skin with intensity that spoke of recognition rather than surprise. He moved with the fluid grace of a dominant wolf who had followed his mate's trail through instinct stronger than conscious thought, who had been drawn by bonds that transcended political obligation and social hierarchy. "You followed me," Lydia said, though it was not accusation but wonder that coloured her voice. The mate bond stretched between them like a bridge of golden light, carrying emotions too complex for words as they faced each other in the grove where her true identity had finally been revealed. "My wolf gave me no choice," Kieran admitted, his voice rough with the effort of maintaining control in the face of power that called to every instinct he possessed. "The moment your abilities began awakening, I felt it through the bond, felt you changing, felt something ancient and magnificent stirring to life in the connection between us." He stopped just beyond the circle of silver radiance that surrounded her, and in his eyes she could see the exact moment recognition crystallized into understanding. The royal necklace blazed against her throat like a star fallen to earth, its ancient symbols proclaiming her identity to anyone with the knowledge to read their meaning. "The Ravencrest seal," he breathed, his voice carrying shock and awe and something that sounded suspiciously like relief. "By the sacred moon, you carry the mark of the lost royal bloodline. You are not a servant. You have never been a servant. You are—" "The rightful Alpha Queen of the Northern Territories," Lydia finished, power flowing through her words with authority she had never possessed before. heir to Evelyn Ravencrest, daughter of a bloodline that was thought extinct, mate to an alpha king who was tricked into an alliance with the conspirators who murdered my family. The revelation hung between them like a sword waiting to fall, reshaping everything they thought they understood about their impossible bond and the political forces that had brought them together. Through the mate connection, Lydia could feel Kieran's mind racing as implications cascaded through his consciousness, as he understood that their meeting was not accident, but destiny, correcting 18 years of injustice. "Seraphina," he said, the name emerging like a curse as understanding dawned in his storm-grey eyes. The Blackthorn alliance, the carefully orchestrated courtship. They knew what you were, and arranged this entire ceremony to ensure that the royal bloodline could never reclaim its throne. "My grandmother trusted the wrong wolves," Lydia said, silver light pulsing around her as ancestral memories flickered through her consciousness. Believed that justice and mercy were enough to maintain peace, that her enemies would be content with lesser positions rather than seeking to eliminate her entirely. She died protecting me, died ensuring that someday the truth would surface despite their best efforts to bury it with her body. Kieran moved closer, entering the circle of radiance that surrounded her with reverence that spoke of recognition rather than mere attraction. When his fingers touched her face with infinite gentleness, the mate bond flared between them like golden lightning, carrying the absolute certainty that they had been destined for each other since before either of them drew breath. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder as he gazed into eyes that now blazed with royal authority. "Do you realize that the universe did not curse us with an impossible bond, but blessed us with the connection that will restore justice to the Northern Territories?" "I understand that tomorrow's ceremony becomes a farce," Lydia said, power making her voice ring with authority that commanded attention from every creature within hearing distance. "I understand that Seraphina and her faction will kill me rather than allow the truth to surface. I understand that everything we thought we knew about duty and obligation and political necessity was built on lies and murder." Through the necklace's connection to her bloodline, she could feel the strength of her ancestors, could sense their approval as their heir finally embraced the destiny that had been stolen from her at birth. The transformation was not yet complete, but already she could feel abilities stirring to life that would allow her to challenge the conspiracy that had shaped pack politics for nearly 2 decades. "They will not touch you," Kieran said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of an Alpha King making a sacred vow. "Whatever comes tomorrow, whatever political consequences follow, you have my protection and my loyalty. The mate bond brought us together, but your birthright makes you my equal in every way that matters." "And the alliance?" Lydia asked, though part of her already knew the answer, could see it reflected in his eyes, as he finally understood that duty and destiny were not opposing forces, but complementary truths that had been deliberately obscured by those who profited from confusion. "There will be no alliance with conspirators and murderers," Kieran said, his wolf rising in his voice with protective fury that made the very air around them crackle with barely contained power. "There will be justice for the crimes committed against your bloodline. There will be restoration of the royal authority that was stolen through treachery, and there will be a mating ceremony that unites 2 bloodlines in service to truth rather than political convenience." The silver light that surrounded Lydia pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and through the forest she could sense other presences stirring, creatures both mundane and supernatural that recognized the awakening of royal power after 18 years of suppression. The grove itself seemed to approve of what was happening, ancient magic responding to the rightful heir finally claiming her inheritance. "I am still learning what I am," Lydia admitted, honesty flowing through the mate bond as easily as breath. "Still discovering abilities that have been locked away since childhood. I do not yet know if I am strong enough to face what tomorrow will bring, if I can stand against enemies who have had years to consolidate their power." "You will not stand alone," Kieran promised, his hand finding hers where the necklace had burned its truth into her palm. The mate bond makes us partners in every sense, and what power I possess serves your cause as readily as my own. Together we are stronger than any conspiracy, more dangerous than any alliance built on lies and murder. Through the golden thread that connected their souls, Lydia could feel his absolute certainty, could sense the way his wolf had claimed her completely, despite every logical reason why such devotion was impossible. The transformation that had begun with Elder Morrigan's revelation was accelerating, power flowing through her with each passing moment as the royal bloodline remembered its true strength. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and absorbed cruelty with practiced endurance was disappearing like mist before the dawn, replaced by something magnificent and terrible, and absolutely unafraid of the enemies who had believed her safely buried with her grandmother's body. Tomorrow the world would discover that some legacies were stronger than any conspiracy, that some bloodlines carried justice in their very essence, and that the universe had its own way of correcting imbalances that had persisted far too long. But tonight, in the sacred grove where her grandmother's spirit watched with approval, Lydia Ravencrest allowed herself to believe that love might be stronger than politics, that destiny might triumph over treachery, and that somewhere in the uncertain future she and Kieran would build something better than the world that had tried so hard to destroy them both. The necklace pulsed against her throat with rhythm that matched their shared heartbeat, and through its ancient magic she could feel tomorrow approaching like a storm that would sweep away the lies and leave only truth standing in its wake. The great hall had been transformed into a cathedral of political ambition, its soaring arches draped with silk banners that proclaimed the unity of two great bloodlines while concealing the murder and treachery that had made this ceremony necessary. Hundreds of witnesses filled the ceremonial space, pack leaders and dignitaries who had travelled from across the Northern Territories to witness what they believed would be the wedding of the century, the alliance that would reshape the balance of power for generations to come. Lydia pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the servants' entrance, the royal necklace hidden beneath her rough grey dress, but pulsing with warmth against her throat like a second heartbeat. The transformation that had begun in the sacred grove continued its relentless progression, power flowing through her body in waves that made her skin tingle with barely contained energy. She could feel every heartbeat in the crowded hall, could taste the emotions that hung in the air like wine on her tongue, could sense the complex web of alliances and resentments that connected the assembled witnesses in patterns of cause and effect. She had not intended to come here, had planned to remain safely hidden in the servant quarters, as both Seraphina's threats and Kieran's warnings had demanded. But the mate bond pulled at her with irresistible force, carrying whispers of his anguish as he prepared to speak vows that would bind him to a woman who represented everything corrupt and treacherous in their world. Her awakening power demanded she witness what was being done in the name of political necessity, demanded she see with her own eyes the ceremony that was designed to cement her enemy's victory. Seraphina stood at the ceremonial altar like a golden goddess draped in emerald silk, her honey-coloured hair arranged in intricate braids that showcased the Blackthorn family jewels, and her perfect features composed into an expression of triumphant satisfaction. She was everything a queen should appear to be, beautiful, poised, radiating the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of never doubting her own worthiness. The assembled crowd gazed at her with appropriate awe, seeing the future of pack politics embodied in her elegant form. But through her awakened senses, Lydia could perceive what others missed, could see beyond the carefully constructed facade to the calculating predator that lurked beneath Seraphina's perfect exterior. The woman who would be queen was a creature of pure ambition, willing to use any method to achieve her goals, and the satisfaction that radiated from her was not the joy of a bride claiming her beloved, but the triumph of a hunter who had successfully eliminated all threats to her dominance. Kieran entered the hall with the controlled grace of a warrior walking to his execution, his storm-grey eyes carefully neutral despite the tumult of emotions that poured through the mate bond. He wore ceremonial robes that proclaimed his status as Alpha King, but Lydia could sense the rebellion that simmered beneath his composed exterior, could feel his wolf pacing with barely contained fury at the injustice of being forced to mate with a woman who represented everything he despised. The officiating elder stepped forward with ancient dignity, his weathered hands raised to command the attention of the assembled crowd. "We gather today to witness the union of two great bloodlines," his voice rang through the hall with ceremonial gravity, "to celebrate the alliance that will bring prosperity and peace to the Northern Territories for generations yet unborn." Through the mate bond, Lydia felt Kieran's revulsion at the lies being spoken in his name, felt his desperate wish that the world could be different than it was. The golden thread that connected their souls stretched taut with his anguish, carrying his love and regret, and the terrible knowledge that duty was about to destroy the most precious thing he had ever found. Before the sacred moon and assembled witnesses, the elder continued, "Do you, Kieran Blackwood, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, take Seraphina Blackthorn as your mate, your queen, your partner in all things?" The moment stretched like eternity, silence filling the great hall as hundreds of witnesses waited for the words that would reshape their political landscape. Lydia pressed her hand to her chest where the royal necklace burned with increasing intensity, her awakening power responding to the injustice being perpetrated in the name of stability and alliance. Kieran began, but the word died on his lips as his storm-grey eyes found hers across the crowded hall, finding her presence despite the shadows that should have kept her hidden. Through the mate bond, she felt the exact moment his resolve crystallized, felt his decision settle into his bones with the weight of destiny finally claiming its due. "I cannot," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "I cannot speak vows of loyalty to a woman whose bloodline is built on murder and treachery." Chaos erupted through the assembled crowd, gasps of shock and cries of outrage filling the ceremonial space as witnesses struggled to comprehend what they had just heard. Seraphina's perfect composure cracked like ice under spring sun, revealing the fury and calculation that lurked beneath her golden exterior. "What did you say?" she demanded, her voice carrying the particular edge of someone who had never been denied anything in her entitled existence. "I said I will not be party to this farce," Kieran replied, his authority making every wolf in the hall feel the weight of absolute dominance. "This ceremony, this alliance, this entire political arrangement is built on lies that have been allowed to fester for 18 years. But even as he spoke, Lydia sensed movement in the shadows near the servants' entrance, felt hostile presences converging on her location with predatory intent. Seraphina's eyes had found her across the crowded hall, recognition blazing in those emerald depths with the fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were being threatened by forces she thought she had eliminated. The attack came without warning, silent assassins emerging from the crowd with weapons that gleamed with silver poison designed to kill wolves regardless of their supernatural healing abilities. They moved with coordinated precision, clearly planning to eliminate the threat Lydia represented before she could fully awaken to her royal heritage. But the necklace around her throat pulsed with sudden heat, ancient magic responding to mortal danger with power that had been dormant for nearly 2 decades. The magical bindings that had suppressed her abilities since birth shattered completely, releasing the full force of the Ravencrest bloodline in a cascade of silver light that turned the great hall bright as noon. Lydia's transformation was visceral and magnificent, her servant's dress burning away like paper before flame as silver radiance poured from her skin with intensity that made witnesses shield their eyes. Her wolf surged forward with savage triumph, no longer the cowering creature that had learned to hide from casual cruelty, but something ancient and terrible and absolutely magnificent in its unleashed fury. The assassin's weapons turned to ash in their hands as her power washed over them, their carefully planned attack dissolving before supernatural abilities that bent reality to the will of the rightful queen. She stood in the centre of the great hall, surrounded by silver fire, no longer the invisible servant who absorbed humiliation with practiced endurance, but the heir to powers that could reshape the political landscape of the entire Northern Territories. "Behold!" rang Elder Morrigan's voice from the shadows where she had been watching, her words carrying the authority of ancient prophecy finally fulfilled. The lost bloodline returns. The rightful Alpha Queen of the Northern Territories stands before you, heir to Evelyn Ravencrest, carrier of justice, delayed but not denied. The royal necklace blazed against Lydia's throat like a star fallen to earth, its ancient symbols proclaiming her identity to anyone with eyes to see. Through the mate bond, she felt Kieran's wonder and triumph, felt his wolf singing with joy as their impossible love revealed its true purpose. But Seraphina was not finished, would not surrender her carefully constructed victory without a fight. "Lies!" she snarled, her golden beauty twisting into something ugly with frustrated ambition. Pretty light shows and desperate theatrics cannot change what she is. A servant pretending to nobility, a broken Omega trying to reach beyond her station. "Then let the truth speak for itself," Lydia said, power making her voice ring with authority that commanded attention from every creature within hearing distance. The silver light that surrounded her pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and through its radiance she could feel the presence of her ancestors, could sense their approval as their heir finally claimed the throne that had been stolen through treachery. The transformation was complete. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and absorbed cruelty with practiced endurance, replaced by something magnificent and terrible, and absolutely unafraid of the enemies who had believed her safely buried with her grandmother's body. The great hall fell silent as witnesses struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing, the revelation that would reshape everything they thought they understood about power and legitimacy and the justice that had been denied for 18 years. Through the mate bond, Lydia could feel Kieran moving toward her, could sense his determination to stand beside her regardless of the political consequences that would follow such a choice. The ceremony that was supposed to cement her enemy's victory had become the stage for truth finally revealing its terrible beauty, for destiny correcting the imbalances that had persisted far too long. The necklace pulsed against her throat with rhythm that matched her racing heart, and in its ancient magic she could feel tomorrow approaching like dawn after the longest night, bright with possibilities that her enemies had never imagined, and justice that would not be denied again. The silver light that poured from Lydia's transformed body intensified until it filled every corner of the great hall, washing over stunned witnesses and illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadows for 18 years. Her power continued its relentless expansion, no longer constrained by the magical bindings that had suppressed her birthright since childhood, and with each passing moment she became more fully what she had always been destined to be, the rightful Alpha Queen whose very existence threatened to topple the corrupt foundations of Northern Territory politics. Through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's awe and fierce protectiveness as he witnessed her complete transformation, could sense his wolf singing with triumphant recognition as their impossible love revealed its true purpose. He moved through the crowd with predatory grace, his storm-grey eyes fixed on her radiant form, while his dominant presence carved a path through witnesses who instinctively yielded before the approach of an alpha king claiming his true mate. But the assembled crowd was not prepared for the magnitude of what they were witnessing, and chaos erupted through the ceremonial hall as centuries of established hierarchy crumbled before the return of a bloodline that most had believed extinct. Some wolves dropped to their knees in instinctive submission to royal authority they recognized on a cellular level, while others recoiled in terror from power that made their primal instincts scream warnings about apex predators whose very presence rewrote the natural order. "Impossible!" Seraphina snarled, her golden beauty twisting into something ugly with frustrated rage as she watched her carefully constructed victory dissolve before supernatural forces she had believed safely eliminated. "She is nothing, a servant, a broken Omega who has somehow managed to create illusions of power through desperate theatrics." "The bloodline does not lie," Elder Morrigan said, stepping from the shadows with ancient dignity radiating from her weathered form. "Every wolf with true sight can see the royal seal blazing from her throat, can recognize the silver fire that marks the Ravencrest heritage, awakening to its full strength. What stands before you is justice delayed, but never denied." The royal necklace pulsed against Lydia's throat with rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat, its ancient runes shifting and writhing in the supernatural radiance as power that had been compressed for nearly 2 decades finally found its full expression. Through its connection to her bloodline, she could feel the presence of every Ravencrest queen who had come before, could sense their approval as their heir finally claimed the throne that had been stolen through murder and conspiracy. "You killed my grandmother," Lydia said, her voice carrying such authority that even the most dominant wolves in the assembled crowd felt compelled to listen. The silver light that surrounded her pulsed with each word, transforming her accusation into something that resonated through the very stones of the hall. "Evelyn Ravencrest died protecting me from conspirators who feared what I would become, who understood that my bloodline carried powers that could expose their treachery and restore justice to territories they had claimed through violence." Seraphina's emerald eyes blazed with fury, but beneath the rage Lydia could see something that looked suspiciously like fear, the particular terror of someone who had built their entire identity on a foundation of lies that was crumbling beneath the weight of revealed truth. "Prove it," she demanded, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose world was collapsing around them. "Prove you are anything more than a servant with delusions of grandeur." The challenge hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall, and through the mate bond Lydia felt Kieran's tension as he understood that this moment would determine not just her fate, but the future of every wolf in the Northern Territories. The assembled witnesses held their collective breath, sensing that they stood at the fulcrum of history, at the point where destiny would either triumph or be crushed beneath the weight of established power. Lydia raised her hand toward the great windows that lined the ceremonial hall, and at her gesture the heavy curtains that blocked the afternoon sunlight burst into silver flames that consumed fabric while leaving stone untouched. Natural light flooded the space, but it was transformed by her power into something pure and revealing, something that stripped away illusions and forced truth into the open, regardless of who might prefer comfortable lies. In that cleansing radiance, the assembled crowd could see what had been hidden from them for decades. They could see the royal bloodline blazing in Lydia's transformed features, could recognize the ancient authority that flowed through her veins like liquid starfire, could understand that the servant who had absorbed their casual cruelty was actually the rightful queen, whose birthright had been stolen through systematic murder. But more than that, they could see Seraphina's true nature revealed in merciless detail. The golden beauty that had captivated so many was exposed as carefully constructed facade, beneath which lurked something calculating and cruel, something that viewed every other creature as either tool or obstacle in pursuit of personal ambition. The noble bloodline, she claimed, was tainted with the violence and treachery that had built her family's power, and in the revealing light her very presence seemed to pollute the sacred space of the ceremonial hall. "Behold the daughter of murderers," Lydia said, her voice ringing with prophetic authority as truth settled into the consciousness of every witness. "Behold the heir to conspiracy and violence, the woman who would be queen through theft rather than birthright, through political convenience rather than divine mandate." The transformation of perception was immediate and absolute. Wolves who had gazed at Seraphina with admiration and respect now recoiled from her presence, their instincts finally free to recognize the corruption that had been hidden beneath surface beauty. The carefully constructed alliance that was supposed to reshape territorial politics crumbled as witnesses understood that they had been manipulated by forces that cared nothing for justice or the greater good. "No!" Seraphina screamed, her composure finally shattering completely as the full magnitude of her defeat became undeniable. "This cannot be happening. I am the chosen queen. I am the future of the Northern Territories. I will not be displaced by some pathetic servant who has managed to conjure pretty lights." But her words carried no authority now, held no power over wolves whose eyes had been opened to the truth of what she represented. The silver radiance that surrounded Lydia continued to expand, washing over every corner of the great hall with cleansing energy that made deception impossible and forced authenticity into the light regardless of personal preference. Kieran reached her side with fluid grace, his presence adding to the supernatural energy that crackled through the transformed space. When his hand found hers, their mate bond blazed with golden fire that intertwined with her silver radiance, creating something beautiful and terrible and absolutely undeniable in its perfection. "I reject the false alliance," Kieran declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an Alpha King, making decisions that would reshape the political landscape of entire territories. "I claim my true mate, the rightful Alpha Queen, whose bloodline carries justice in its very essence. Let all witnesses understand that this ceremony now serves destiny rather than political convenience." The assembled crowd erupted in responses that ranged from awe to terror to desperate attempts to realign themselves with power structures that were being rewritten before their eyes. Some wolves prostrated themselves before the revealed queen, recognizing royal authority that demanded submission from every instinct they possessed. Others fled toward the exits, understanding that they had been complicit in conspiracy and fearing the justice that would inevitably follow such revelation. But Seraphina was not finished, would not surrender her dreams of power without one final desperate gambit. Her hand moved to the ceremonial dagger that hung at her waist, its blade gleaming with silver poison designed to kill even supernatural creatures whose healing abilities made them nearly immortal. "If I cannot have the throne," she snarled, raising the weapon with deadly intent, "then no one will." The attack came with desperate fury, but Lydia was no longer the powerless servant who had absorbed cruelty with practiced endurance. Her royal bloodline sang with protective instincts, her awakened abilities responding to mortal danger with speed that made time itself seem sluggish by comparison. Silver light erupted from her body with force that sent Seraphina flying across the ceremonial hall, her weapon turning to ash before it could make contact with its intended target. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," Lydia said, power making her words resonate through stone and flesh alike. The Ravencrest bloodline returns to claim what was stolen, to restore balance that has been missing for 18 years, to ensure that truth finally triumphs over the comfortable lies that have allowed corruption to flourish. Through the mate bond, she felt Kieran's fierce pride and absolute devotion, felt his wolf's recognition that they had found not just love, but partnership in the truest sense, the joining of two forces that together could reshape their world according to principles of justice rather than political convenience. The great hall fell silent as witnesses absorbed the full implications of what they had witnessed, as they understood that the ceremony they had come to observe had become something far more significant than political alliance. They had witnessed the return of the lost royal bloodline, the revelation of truth that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades, the moment when destiny finally corrected the imbalances that had poisoned their society for far too long. Seraphina lay crumpled against the far wall where Lydia's power had thrown her, her golden beauty finally revealing the ugliness that had always lurked beneath carefully constructed facades. The conspiracy that had shaped pack politics for 18 years was exposed, its primary architect revealed as the daughter of murderers whose entire existence was built on violence and treachery. The silver radiance that surrounded Lydia began to soften into something warm and welcoming, no longer the harsh light of revelation, but the gentle glow of rightful authority finally claiming its proper place. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself worthless was gone forever, replaced by the Alpha Queen whose very existence promised that justice would no longer be denied to those who deserved protection from the predators who preyed upon the vulnerable. Through the transformed space of the Great Hall, Lydia could sense the future taking shape around them, could feel possibilities unfolding like flowers after winter, as truth finally displaced the lies that had governed their world for too long. Tomorrow would bring challenges and decisions and the complex work of rebuilding society according to principles that honoured both strength and compassion. But tonight belonged to recognition and restoration and the triumph of love over political convenience. The mate bond pulsed between her and Kieran with rhythm that matched their synchronized heartbeats, carrying promises of partnership and shared purpose, and the knowledge that together they could build something better than the world that had tried so hard to destroy them both. The great hall buzzed with tension so thick it seemed to coat the ancient stones in anticipation of violence. The assembled witnesses divided into factions that glared at each other across a chasm of political necessity and revealed truth. 3 hours had passed since Lydia's transformation had shattered the carefully constructed ceremony. 3 hours since the conspiracy that had shaped pack politics for 18 years had been exposed before hundreds of witnesses who now faced the terrifying prospect of choosing sides in a conflict that would determine the future of the Northern Territories. Serafina stood at the centre of a tight circle of loyalists, her golden beauty marred by cuts from her collision with the ceremonial wall, but her emerald eyes blazing with the particular fury of someone whose entire world had been torn away by forces she could not control. The bruises that darkened her perfect features seemed to emphasize rather than diminish the calculating intelligence that had always lurked beneath her surface charm, and even defeat could not entirely extinguish the aura of dangerous ambition that had carried her so close to ultimate power. "This is madness," declared Lord Marcus Blackthorne, Serafina's father, his weathered face twisted with indignation as he surveyed the chaos his daughter's exposed treachery had created. "You would overturn centuries of established order based on the hysterical claims of a servant girl who has somehow learned to conjure pretty lights. You would destroy carefully negotiated alliances for the sake of ancient bloodlines that mean nothing in the practical world of modern politics." His words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades building power through careful manipulation and strategic violence. Someone who understood that authority came not from mystical heritage, but from the willingness to crush anyone who stood in the path of personal ambition. Around him clustered the traditionalist faction, wolves who had profited from the existing power structure and who viewed Lydia's revelation as existential threat to everything they had worked to achieve. But ranged against them stood an equally formidable coalition, pack leaders and dignitaries who had witnessed the impossible and understood that they stood at a crossroads where choice would define not just their political allegiances, but their moral legacy. Elder Morrigan moved among them with ancient authority, her pale eyes blazing with satisfaction as truth finally displaced the comfortable lies that had governed their society for far too long. "The bloodline speaks for itself," she declared, her voice carrying the particular resonance that came from decades of serving as conduit between the living and the ancestral spirits who watched over pack destiny. "Every wolf with true sight can recognise the royal seal, can feel the power that flows through Evelyn Ravencrest's air. To deny what stands before us is to choose wilful blindness over uncomfortable truth." Lydia stood beside Kieran at the ceremonial altar, the silver radiance that poured from her transformed body, casting everything in ethereal light that made deception impossible and forced authenticity into the open. The royal necklace blazed against her throat like a captive star, its ancient runes shifting and writhing as they proclaimed her identity to any who possessed the knowledge to read their meaning. She had grown into her power with each passing hour, had learned to channel abilities that had been suppressed since birth, until she radiated the kind of authority that made submission feel less like defeat and more like natural response to rightful leadership. Through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's protective fury, could sense his wolf pacing with barely contained violence as he faced enemies who had built their power on the murder of innocents. His storm-grey eyes scanned the assembled factions with predatory focus, cataloguing threats and calculating the most efficient methods of eliminating anyone who posed danger to his newly revealed mate. "I challenge the pretender's right to rule," Seraphina announced, her voice carrying clearly through the transformed space, despite the cuts that marked her throat where Lydia's power had thrown her against unforgiving stone. "I invoke the ancient law of trial by combat to determine the legitimate mate of the Alpha King, to settle this dispute through strength rather than theatrical displays of conjured light." The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and through the great hall rippled the particular tension that always accompanied formal challenges between dominant wolves. The ancient laws were clear and absolute, older than the political structures that currently governed pack society, and even those who supported Lydia's claim could not deny Seraphina's right to invoke trial by combat as final arbiter of disputed succession. "You cannot be serious," Kieran snarled, his authority making the very air crackle with barely contained power. "You would risk your life in combat rather than accept the truth that has been revealed before hundreds of witnesses." "I would reclaim what was stolen from me," Seraphina replied, her emerald eyes fixed on Lydia with hatred so pure it seemed to poison the space between them. "I would expose this pathetic servant's conjured illusions through the one trial that cannot be faked or manipulated. Let her face me in the circle with nothing but her own strength, and we shall see whose bloodline truly deserves to rule." The challenge was clever, Lydia realised, with growing dread, designed to exploit the one weakness in her newly revealed identity. Her power was real, was magnificent, was everything the royal bloodline promised it would be. But power without training was dangerous to wielder as much as opponent, and she had spent her entire life learning to be invisible rather than learning to fight. Seraphina, by contrast, had been trained from childhood in the arts of combat, had studied under masters who understood that political authority ultimately rested on the willingness and ability to destroy anyone who challenged established order. "The law is clear," declared Elder Thorson, the ancient arbitrator whose authority transcended pack boundaries and whose word carried the weight of sacred tradition. "Trial by combat may be invoked by either party in disputes of succession or mating rights. The challenge has been formally issued and witnessed. It must be answered or conceded within the span of 3 heartbeats." Through the mate bond, Lydia felt Kieran's desperate desire to intervene, to claim the right of combat as her mate and protector, to shield her from dangers that her awakened power might not be sufficient to overcome. But the ancient laws were explicit in their requirements, and challenges involving royal succession could only be answered by the claimants themselves, not by their chosen partners or political allies. "I accept," Lydia said, power flowing through her voice with authority that surprised even herself. Around the great hall she could sense the mixed reactions of witnesses, some admiring her courage, while others feared that inexperience would lead to disaster that would destroy their last hope of justice finally being restored to the Northern Territories. "Lydia, no," Kieran said, his voice rough with desperate protectiveness. "You have just awakened to your power. You have no training in formal combat, no experience with the kind of violence that Seraphina has been preparing for her entire life. This is exactly what they want, exactly what they have planned from the moment your identity was revealed. "And if I refuse?" Lydia asked, though part of her already knew the answer, could see it reflected in the calculating satisfaction that flickered across Seraphina's perfect features. "If I decline the challenge, I confirm their claims that my power is nothing but illusion, that my bloodline is irrelevant to the practical realities of leadership. I validate their argument that servants should remain in their assigned places regardless of supernatural heritage or destined bonds." The terrible logic of the situation crystallized around them like ice forming on water, trapping them in circumstances that offered no easy escape from dangers that threatened everything they had fought to protect. Through her awakened connection to the royal bloodline, Lydia could feel the presence of her ancestors, could sense their mixed reactions to the challenge that would determine whether 18 years of injustice would finally be corrected or whether the conspiracy would triumph through violence, as it had when they murdered her grandmother. "The combat circle will be prepared," Elder Thorson announced, his weathered voice carrying the weight of sacred ritual that transcended personal preference or political convenience. At sunset, when the ancient laws decree such matters must be settled, the claimants will face each other with nothing but their own strength and the justice of their causes to determine the rightful queen of the Northern Territories. Around the great hall, the assembled witnesses began preparing for trial by combat, some departing to make arrangements while others remained to observe the preparations with the kind of morbid fascination that always accompanied formal challenges between powerful wolves. The tension that filled the space was no longer merely political, but primal, the recognition that they would witness something ancient and absolute, something that would settle disputes through methods older than civilization itself. Lydia pressed her hand to the royal necklace that pulsed against her throat, drawing strength from its connection to generations of queens who had faced their own trials and emerged victorious through combinations of power and wisdom and sheer determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. She was afraid, more terrified than she had ever been in her life, of quiet desperation and casual cruelty. But beneath the fear burned something brighter and more dangerous, something that whispered that she had not survived 18 years of systematic suppression, only to surrender now when justice finally seemed within reach. Through the mate bond, she felt Kieran's wolf reaching for her, offering strength and support and absolute faith in her ability to triumph over enemies who had underestimated the power that flowed through royal veins. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and believed herself worthless was gone forever, replaced by something magnificent and terrible and willing to risk everything for the chance to build a world where strength served justice rather than personal ambition. The sun moved toward the horizon with inexorable certainty, and with its descent approached the trial that would determine whether the Ravencrest bloodline would reclaim its rightful place or whether the conspiracy that had murdered her grandmother would finally succeed in eliminating the last threat to their corrupt dominance. But in the growing shadows of the great hall, surrounded by silver light and ancestral approval and the absolute devotion of her destined mate, Lydia began to understand that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, that some truths were more important than personal survival, and that sometimes the universe demanded that its chosen champions risk everything for the chance to restore balance that had been missing for far too long.